Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, dear friends. I'm Father Tom Rosica, the president of Assumption University and also the CEO of Salt and Light Catholic Television Network in Canada. And it's a great joy for us this evening to launch a new season of the Christian Culture Lecture Series. We begin tonight in the light of the very significant events that just took place in the Universal Church. I'd like to extend a special welcome to Bishop Ron Fabro, the Bishop of the Diocese of London, and also to Tony Spence, who's the head of the Catholic News Service, CNS, of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops in Washington. Tony came up just for this. To many priests that are here, and clergy from the Diocese of London and from the Windsor area, you are most welcome, as well as so many friends. This evening's lecture, Power, Personalities, and Politics at the Vatican, is obviously a big draw, because who isn't interested in power, politics, and personalities at the Vatican? The eyes of the world were fixed on the Vatican from January, the end of January, February, and March of this year. Let me begin in introducing our speaker with a couple words that are on our vocabulary today. We all hear words like a barista. If you go to Erie Street and you go to one of the Italian coffee shops, people who make Italian coffee are not just working in the bar, they're baristas. And they have a whole art form and a dance when they make this coffee, espresso coffee. You've heard of comunista. If you have anything to do with world politics, you know about comunistas. And maybe you heard of sandinistas. You heard of fascistas, fascists. You've heard of optimistas, optimistic people. You heard of turistas, if you've gone to Latin American countries, or Spain, or maybe even Argentina. Fashionistas, people who like nice clothes, many of you here tonight. But there's another ista that's in our midst tonight that is a very rare breed, Vaticanista. What is a Vaticanista? Is it a disease? Is it a pasta dish? Is it a quirk? Is it a curiosity? Tonight we have in our midst a Vaticanista in the flesh. John Thavis is a journalist, author, and speaker specializing in Vatican and religious affairs. He's known in the trade as a Vaticanista, a calling that became clear only after a rather circuitous path in his life. He grew up in Minnesota, attending Catholic schools, and graduated from St. John's University, the great Benedictine university in Collegeville. After he studied classical languages, he went to Italy as a student of archaeology in 1977. He immediately fell in love with that country. He didn't leave. He began a brilliant journalistic career the following year in 1978. And for those of you with a good memory, 1978 was quite a career beginning year. The year of the two popes, of the three popes, Pope Paul VI's death, the election of John Paul I, and 33 days later, the death of that pope, and then John Paul II. What a way to begin. He returned to Minnesota in 1979, working as a reporter, then as news editor of the daily newspaper in his hometown. In 1982, he married Lauren O'Connell. They moved back to Italy. They landed in Rome with very little in their pockets and a suitcase, and thus began a 30-year Italian adventure. He began by writing a guidebook to Rome and worked part-time for the Associated Press, ABC News, and the Wine Spectator. It's quite a combination. In 1983, he took a job reporting with Catholic News Service, which is the world's premier English Catholic media service under the auspices of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And it's an honor tonight to have Tony Spence with us. We are blessed and honored this evening to also reiterate the wonderful relationship that exists between the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops and the USCCB, United States Bishops, through Catholic News Service. And if Salt and Light has a partner, the most cherished partner is CNS, Catholic News Service. For more than 25 years, John Thavis held one of the most fascinating journalistic jobs in the world, reporting on the inner workings of the Vatican. His daily exposure to the power, politics, and personalities in the seat of the Roman Catholicism gave him a unique, behind-the-scenes perspective on an institution that is far less monolithic and unified than it appears on the surface. He traveled with Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict to more than 60 countries and reported on other religious stories from Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. He became the CNS Rome Bureau Chief in 1996 and served 3 years as president of the Association of International Journalists accredited to the Vatican, the only American ever elected to that position. He won numerous journalistic awards and has lectured on Vatican affairs in the United States and Europe. In 2012, he retired from CNS position to devote full time to writing, and then he moved back to the United States. His best-selling book, The Vatican Diaries, was providentially published on the eve of Pope Benedict's resignation in February. Some of John's envious and mean colleagues have said that Benedict waited for John to finish the book before announcing his resignation in order to boost sales for the Vatican Diaries, and also to confirm John's numerous theories and his approval of the election of Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio on March the 13th. John was one of a very small group of people who got it right. The Italians got it all wrong. In fact, John told the story correctly and helped us to understand the gift we received in the person of Pope Francis. He and his wife and 3 children, who were raised in Rome, are now back in the States. They relocated back to Minnesota. And as soon as I found out what happened in Rome in January, February, and March, I could think of no better person to help us understand the story. Ladies and gentlemen, to launch this year's lecture series, I invite John Thavis to the podium.
That's quite an introduction. I will try to live up to it. I want to thank you all for coming, first of all. This is a great crowd. And thank Assumption University for this great honor. I thank Bishop Ronald Fabro for being here, my former boss, Tony Spence, for coming all the way from Washington. And of course, it's especially meaningful to me to have this honor presented by Father Tom Rosica, who I consider one of the great Catholic communicators. In fact, he's a great communicator, period. Salt and Light TV, I think, is a model, a success model for Catholic communications. And Father Tom and I go way back. I still remember in 2002, I think it was, he brought a group of young Canadians into the Catholic News Service Rome Bureau and marched them into our office and sat them down and said, "Here, talk to these people. There's a good story here." Well, he was right. And World Youth Day, by the way, in Toronto later that year will still go down as one of the best organized events in recent church history, especially when it comes to the needs of the media. And as you will see, that is really the main theme of my talk today. I think to understand the power, politics, and personalities at the Vatican, you really need to understand how the modern church, and especially the Vatican, uses the media. And there are hits and there are misses, and I will talk about both. These are exciting times to be a Catholic. We've just had a pope who resigned for the first time in many hundreds of years, and in one fell swoop, changed the nature of the modern papacy. We have a new pope who seems intent on doing things differently, in a simpler, more evangelical way. We have a lot to communicate, and I was fortunate enough to be in Rome for that series of historic events in February and March. I covered the Vatican for 30 years, but as Father Tom said, last year I moved back to Minnesota with most of my family. And what did I do in Minnesota? Well, I put the finishing touches on my book, and once a Vaticanista, always a Vaticanista, I did what any Vaticanista does, because old habits die hard. I was on the computer looking up what's in the Vatican Bulletin today, what's the Vatican Radio reporting today. my children and my wife kind of looked at me a little strangely. You're still connected, aren't you, they would say. And I'd say, I guess so. I read the Vatican's daily bulletin, anything connected with the Pope. And about the middle of the year, I began to see a pattern, certain signs. It really was a case, I think, of thank goodness I was far away, because it helped. I saw that Pope Benedict had completed a number of things. He had completed his series of books on Jesus of Nazareth. He had completed an 8-year-long series of meetings, ad limina meetings, with bishops from around the world. He had launched his legacy project, the New Evangelization in a Synod of Bishops. And in November, he named 6 new cardinals, which set off alarm bells for me because he had already named cardinals earlier in the year. He seemed to be topping up for a conclave. I emailed my journalist friends in Rome and asked them, do you think the Pope is getting ready to resign? And their answers, which I have since read back to them, and they don't like to hear them, the answers read back to them, were basically verbal shrugs. Well, I don't think so. He seems to be plugging along. And for them, I can understand that. He popped up on their radar every day, and there was no reason to think that he would suddenly disappear from their radar. But in January, I looked at Pope Benedict's calendar for 2013, and I saw that he really had nothing that required his presence. And I bought a ticket to Rome. I should acknowledge some selfish interest in all of this. I had my book coming out in February, and I needed to touch base with my Rome sources, my Vatican sources. And I realized that if a papal resignation were to coincide with my book launch, I would be in the catbird seat. I always thought Benedict would resign, by the way. It was really an open secret. 2 years ago, in a book-length interview, the Pope said, under some circumstances, it is not only a right, but perhaps a duty to resign. And I think he had resignation in mind from the first day of his pontificate. He had watched Blessed Pope John Paul II linger in office. And I think that, like most Catholics, he saw that as a moment of grace for the Church, a Pope who suffered on the world stage, but whose faith gave meaning to that suffering. A Pope who struggled heroically at the end. John Paul II was at his window a week before he died, trying to speak. But I think Pope Benedict, then Cardinal Ratzinger, was also a supreme rationalist. And he realized that while you can pray for a pope to remain physically and mentally capable, you cannot demand that from God. And I think that he knew that sooner or later a pope was going to be incapacitated, have a stroke or whatever, and perhaps have to disappear for months or longer and be hidden from the world, and that would harm the Church. I always thought that if Benedict resigned, it would be in February, and I had a date in mind, February 22nd, the Feast of the Chair of Peter. This is a feast day tied to the authority of the papacy, and I thought it would be typical of Benedict to link such a dramatic new gesture to Church tradition. Well, I was wrong about the date. I arrived in Rome February 10th, and the next morning I walked into the Vatican press office to hear that Pope Benedict had just resigned. My colleagues, my journalistic colleagues from the Vatican's Sala Stampa, looked up at me, saw me for the first time in a year. They looked very suspicious. And they said, "What are you doing here? You knew." Well, I didn't know, but as I say, there were signs. I ended up staying in Rome for 7 weeks. And like most people trying to cover the resignation and conclave, I worried about getting accurate information. And I have to say that one of the most reassuring moments I had was when I saw Father Tom Rosica walk into the Vatican press office where he had been summoned to help Father Federico Lombardi deal with the 5,000 journalists who had descended on Rome. I have great admiration for Father Lombardi, who is the Vatican spokesman. But as I'll explain later, he often fights an internal battle when it comes to transparency. With Father Rosica at his side, they actually won some of those battles. When the cardinals came to Rome for the conclave, there was an interesting dynamic at work, and one that I had not seen in my 30 years. Many of the cardinals saw Benedict as, of course, a fine pope, a great teacher, but also as a victim of a Vatican bureaucracy that was at times inept, if not corrupt. Some of the cardinals were openly critical of the Roman Curia. Cardinals held daily meetings, and at one point, Cardinal Jorge Maria Bergoglio of Argentina stood up and expressed a new vision of the church, one that is less self-referencing, less focused on its own theology and structures, and more active in the real world of modern men and women. A church that not only talks about the poor, but lives in solidarity with the poor. A church willing to reduce the bureaucratic barrier represented by some Vatican offices. Well, the cardinals liked what they heard from Cardinal Bergoglio. And by the way, yes, I have been credited with calling the election of Cardinal Bergoglio because, I felt very shy when I was first credited with this, but as time goes on, I find myself more and more willing to accept the burden of being one of the few people who predicted his election. 2 days before the conclave began, I did single him out on my blog as a candidate whose star was rising. I was simply reflecting what my sources told me, including some cardinals. Perhaps I also had in mind an earlier conversation I had with Father Tom Rosica over coffee in the Borgo, who told me what a great pope Cardinal Bergoglio would make. Let me be clear, Father Rosica told me no secrets, he just set me on the right path. So the cardinals came to Rome, elected Cardinal Bergoglio as pope, and then they went home, leaving him alone to navigate a world he really does not know very well. My book explains what Pope Francis should expect. And yes, I hope he is reading my book. It explains what his battlefield will be if he really wants to reform the Vatican. And I think my book explains part of the reason why Pope Benedict resigned and why he felt so frustrated at the series of missteps, leaks, and power struggles that took place in his own backyard. I wrote the book because I was convinced that the public perception of the Vatican is a caricature. Now, typically, people see the Vatican as a monolithic power structure, hermetically sealed, a kind of classic hierarchy where the orders come down from on top and then are carried out in lockstep by the underlings. The reality is quite different. The Vatican, I know, is a place where curia cardinals speak out of turn, where leaks are quite common, and where the left hand often doesn't know what the right hand is doing. It is a place that is much more decentralized than people imagine. It's a place where lower-level officials have a surprising degree of freedom to operate, and these bit players often take center stage. And the lines of authority run in odd directions. You know, the Roman Curia is like a mosaic of fiefdoms, quite resistant to streamlining. That's what I wanted to convey. The flavor of the Vatican, the personalities, the atmosphere, and the humanness of the place. Part of this backstage reality at the Vatican, a big part of it, is that there are strong tensions pulling in different directions. In particular, a tension between transparency and secrecy, between the demands of modern communication and the old ways of protecting confidentiality inside the Vatican walls. And we see this as journalists every day. A pope who gives off-the-cuff remarks to journalists, but his aides believe that they can take his actual words that he spoke and rewrite them for the history books. The Vatican launches social media projects, but really none of them are interactive. Or the latest example, the Pope declares he's taken this revolutionary step of resigning, and he makes his announcement in Latin, so that about half the cardinals in the room did not really get what he was saying. These tensions run through almost everything that happens at the Vatican, and certainly in the episodes that I relate in my book. Chapter 1 is about a bell ringer who refuses to ring the bells of St. Peter's when a pope is elected because he's received the order to ring the bells from a Swiss guard. And as you might guess, there's an ancient turf battle between the basilica employees and the Swiss guards. Or the Vatican, another chapter focuses on a sex abuse case, a rather infamous one, where the Vatican investigated accusations against the founder of a religious order. But its own high officials in the Secretariat of State were at the very same time still protecting this man. The sainthood cause of Pope Pius XII, another topic in my book. It has a behind-the-scenes drama, a go-slow order from the top of the hierarchy, but a gung-ho activism from Pius's biggest supporters, including a feisty American nun and a German Jesuit. So, yes, in terms of organizational efficiency, the Vatican moves in different directions. Some would call it dysfunctional, but it is fascinating. And that's part of the problem as a journalist and an author. For me, it's immensely more interesting to cover a Vatican where not every secret can be kept and where cardinals are too candid than a Vatican that runs with machine-like efficiency. So, while I wish Pope Francis well in reforming the Vatican and making everything work better, I hope he doesn't smooth out all the rough edges. I might have another book to write. I want to zero in tonight on what I think is the Vatican's main challenge today. I believe the Vatican is at a communications crossroads. Now, at times this looks like a crisis, at times it looks like a golden opportunity. Some of the problems in communications are well known. You know, over the last few years, the world has been treated to headlines. The Papal Butler feeding secret documents to the press. Or the Pope who rehabilitated a Holocaust-denying archbishop. Or, and this actually happened, a Vatican preacher who appeared to equate criticism of church officials on sex abuse to the suffering endured by Jews in the Holocaust. I think these recent episodes are all part of a structural problem at the Vatican. The fact is, the Vatican is an institution of many voices, yet it is expected to speak with a single voice to the world, and it operates in an age of electronic media that will broadcast news immediately and magnify any hint of conflict, any mistake, any false step. What are some of the reasons for this state of affairs? Well, one big reason is that Vatican officials don't talk to each other much. It may seem incredible to outsiders, but Vatican departments, by and large, keep to themselves. There are few, if any, cabinet-style meetings or major planning sessions or even inter-office memos that keep people apprised of what's going on down the hall or across St. Peter's Square. And when the Pope does call in representatives of the Universal Church, it's often in an assembly that's so large that it becomes unwieldy. It doesn't really get immediate results. I think another reason for this communications challenge is, perhaps you could call it a values gap. I think the Church today still feels uncomfortable with some of the values of the contemporary world. In particular, the focus on democratic participation in decision-making, on transparency, on accountability of our institutions. You know, in the Vatican's view, those ideals are generally positive, but they're not an exact fit with the concept of the Church as a communion of believers that finds unity in the figure of the Pope. So it's not really surprising to see the Vatican struggle with the demands of the news media and the global communications culture. The Vatican generally does not hold public hearings. It does not sell its message well to the media, and it does not speak in sound bites. A third aspect is a degree of incompatibility, I think, between the Vatican and social media. I mentioned the Church wants to be on Facebook, in the blogosphere, on Twitter, but this world lacks a clear hierarchy, and that is frightening to some people at the Vatican. The Vatican is on the internet. It wants to strengthen its presence there, but they are still wrestling with big issues. If interactivity is the hallmark of a successful website, and I would add of successful evangelization, that poses a challenge for the Church. Social media are generally uncensored forms of two-way communication, but you don't find comment boxes on Vatican websites. The problem, I think, is that the Church does not want to appear to be hosting a platform for dissent. Last year, Pope Benedict began tweeting. I mean, it was a corporate tweet, okay? He wasn't writing out his tweets on his iPad, believe me. It was done for him. There was a debate inside the Vatican over putting the Pope on Twitter, precisely because it exposed him to disparaging retweets and comments. And I do understand this reluctance, because we all know how savage and insulting the internet can be. By the way, I think this debate over Twitter is not yet over, although Pope Francis is still tweeting for now. Another factor in the communications challenge is language. The Vatican generally speaks the language of faith. Now, the language of faith can sound, at times, exclusive. We live in the age of tolerance, and phrases like Christ is the unique Savior or the Church is necessary for salvation can strike some people as intolerant. One of the problems, I think, is that academic or ecclesial language can have a very specific meaning to church officials, but can also be politically insensitive. This language is not designed to insult people, but it does, in fact, offend them. For example, when homosexuality is described as disordered, or Protestant communities are told they are defective, whatever the intent, that can sound bad. And finally, the attitude of the Vatican toward communicating information is still proprietary. You know, in the United States and probably in Canada, getting timely, accurate information is treated like a consumer's right. At the Vatican, it's still treated like a privilege. In this environment, as a journalist, you have to create special channels. I'm not talking about anything illegal here, just showing lots of interest, cultivating sources, you make frequent phone calls, and yes, occasional lunches. Although in my experience, I found most of my best sources don't want to be seen lunching with me. But at the Vatican, even when communication has been made, or words have been spoken by a pope or another official, the Vatican has a proprietary approach that can boggle the mind. They believe, as I mentioned before, that they can change the Pope's words and rewrite them for the official record. Now, in my book, I describe when Pope Benedict declared to journalists aboard his plane to Mexico in 2007. He was going to Brazil, and he was asked a question about Mexican legislation. He said that Mexican legislators who supported legal abortion should be excommunicated. Well, he misspoke. I mean, that had to be retracted, and in effect, it was done by simply changing the Pope's actual words in the written record. It didn't do much good, of course, because journalists had already reported his words. Airplanes have telephones now, and by the time the Vatican got around to saying no, it didn't happen, it was gone around the world. I remember a couple of days after he was elected, Pope Benedict told German pilgrims that as the conclave votes moved in his favor, he felt like the guillotine was being prepared. And he added, with what I assume was dry humor, that he had prayed to God to spare him, but apparently God wasn't listening that day. Well, when the official version came out, that last bit about praying to God was cut out. I guess that was just bordered on the heretical. On another occasion, the Pope caught people's attention in the audience. It was a general audience in St. Peter's Square. when he spoke about the saints as human beings. He said they had problems and even sins. You know, the crowd interrupted him at that point with applause. For a pope he had put down his prepared remarks and speaking off the cuff, and he wanted to make the points, the saints were people like you and me. They were sinners. It wasn't often that the crowd interrupted Pope Benedict with applause, and we reported it. But guess what? The official text removed any reference to the sins of the saints. Instead, it had the Pope saying that the saints had complicated problems. I once pressed people at the Vatican about this issue of changing the Pope's words, and I was told there is no official text until it comes out in the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, which, by the way, is often issued months or even a year later, so not in time for the news cycle. Part of the problem with communication at the Vatican, of course, is the media. My book is, I think, fairly tough on the Vatican in the sense that I tried to be as honest as I could. I think the same can be said about its treatment of the media. You know, I don't paint myself as a hero in my book. At one point in my book, I'm slinking through the grass in South Africa, trying to reach a woman who was at the front of a papal mass, who was crying so hard that I could almost not interview her. She had just lost a friend to a shooting that took place the day before she had arrived. And as I slinked back through the grass with my interview in hand, I felt like, wow, that was great. And I kind of call myself out on it in the book, because when you're a journalist, you sometimes want to get the story, and you'll do anything to get it, even crawl through the grass at a papal mass. The media, I think, misreads the Vatican quite often. Usually, the media conflates events. It reads too much into a line in the Vatican newspaper. It takes one Monsignor as the Vatican. You know, I don't know how many times I've seen this. The Vatican says. The Vatican endorses the Simpsons. The Vatican loves the Beatles. You know, it's somebody writing a news article in the Osservatore Romano. The media hunts for sound bites in encyclicals, and there aren't many there. It sees a grand design whenever something goes awry, and the grand design is usually not there. I think the case of the Papal Butler was a perfect example. You know, journalists tended to see a Machiavellian scheme here. I'm presuming you all know about the Papal Butler, right? He was the man whose job it was to serve the Pope his meals and fold his clothes and pack his bag, and in his off hours, he was secretly photocopying the Pope's documents and slipping them to an Italian journalist. Journalists assumed when he was caught that this was the tip of the iceberg. There must be some kind of Machiavellian plot at work here. Surely he had people piloting him, higher-ups. Well, in reality, I think he was an unbalanced, gullible man who had delusions of grandeur and who ended up, unfortunately, as the layman closest to the Pope. He photocopied his documents on the office photocopier, often in full view of two papal secretaries. How did this happen? That's my question. How did he get his job? That's another of my questions. Well, he was raccomandato. That's the way you get jobs at the Vatican. It depends on who you know. You won't find Vatican positions advertised in the want ads. The Vatican police found thousands of documents in the butler's apartment. They also found gifts to the Pope that had gone missing, including a check for 100,000 euros. How do you lose track of a check for 100,000 euros? I know I wouldn't. You know, that to me is really part of the real scandal here. It's lack of communication. It's not a secret plot involving Roman Curia officials. As I wrote in my book, the Vatican often seems less like Machiavelli and more like Keystone Cops, for those of you who remember Keystone Cops. And now we have a new pope. By the way, I don't fault Pope Benedict for much of what I've just spoken about. I think Pope Benedict made it clear when he was elected at age 78 that he was not going to come in with the idea of reforming or even having much of a hands-on management approach to the Roman Curia, which is the Vatican bureaucracy. I think he assumed, let it do its business. I'll focus on my priorities, and his priorities were primarily teaching. And I think that as a teacher, he will be remembered as a great one. I don't think as a manager, he will be remembered as a great pope. We now have a new pope, and I think that with the election of Pope Francis, we're seeing the pendulum swing, I hope definitively, toward transparency. Why do I think there are reasons for hope? Well, number one, the new pope has a direct and simple way of communicating. His mini magisterium at morning masses are examples. For example, every morning he has a mass for employees and friends of the Vatican from different departments. And he delivers these off-the-cuff homilies that are just homespun lessons, and yet they are jewel-like in their clarity. And they're very hard-hitting. They're so hard-hitting that they're drawing more attention than probably his more formal speeches from journalists. Pope Francis has expressed a desire for a church that is less self-referencing and less focused on its own theology. What does that mean? That's going to make its message easier for most people to understand. I mean, Pope Benedict was a great theologian, and he was a great academic writer. But I don't think most people could read his books on Jesus of Nazareth one time through and get it. I read them twice, and I did get them. They're beautiful, but I don't think they're made for the everyday person. Pope Francis told journalists he wants a church for the poor and a church that is poor. He's followed that up with some very hard-hitting words about slave labor, for example, in the Bangladeshi factory that blew up, about the danger of pastors caring more about money than about the souls of the faithful. Last week, he gave us this, and I'll read you a brief 3 lines of what he said. In a world where there is so much talk about rights, it seems that the only thing that has rights is money. Dear brothers and sisters, we live in a world where money rules. We live in a world, in a culture, where money worship reigns. I think we can expect a lot from this Pope about social justice issues. He has put word out recently that he intends to write an encyclical, which would be the first encyclical written on his own, called Beati Pauperes, Blessed are the Poor. So we will get the words, but I think we'll also get action and witness. Reform of Vatican finances, for example, which is long overdue. The Pope's decision to live in the Vatican guest house and not the papal apartments is tremendously important. Not just because his 2-room lodging is pretty Spartan compared to the 10-room formal apartments, but it's geographically important. The papal apartments are deep inside the apostolic palace. They are surrounded by Roman Curia offices, and that means access is super limited. You know, the Pope couldn't say Mass every morning for 50 or 60 people, as he's doing in the Vatican guest house where he's staying. And he would not be eating in a dining room with 30 or 40 people either. In the apostolic palace, he would be living in a kind of invisible cage. He would be isolated. And if it's one thing we've learned about Pope Francis is that he doesn't want to be isolated. He is a people person. By moving out of the papal apartments, the Pope has also moved out of what I call the Vatican's gilt frame. Those sumptuous frescoed hallways and rooms that are the backdrop of almost every papal photo op. You know, I often tell people the Vatican is not rich. The Vatican is not really wealthy. And they look at me like I'm crazy, because what they see on TV is the sumptuous backdrop. I tell them the Vatican has a budget of $330 million a year. That's their operating budget, which isn't much for 4,000 employees and running a kind of worldwide operation. It's less than most American universities. I think Francis understands that, the way the Vatican is seen in the media, the image really counts. Pope Francis's words so far have been as powerful and clear as his gestures. For example, his words to priests, "Don't be a manager, don't be the one who says, 'I'm the boss.' Get out with your faithful, share their problems." And that beautiful phrase he used, "As shepherds, pastors should have the odor of sheep." We saw that the new pope does appreciate the power of gestures when he chose on Holy Thursday to wash the feet of young inmates in a Rome prison, including 2 women. I think he was saying, in effect, that the witness of service trumps the whole liturgical debate and interpretation over, the institution of the priesthood at the Last Supper. Again, it's an emphasis less on what the church has to say to itself and more on what the church has to say to the world. And I think probably he was concerned primarily with what that gesture did in the lives of those 12 people whose feet he washed. He communicates humility, not because it's good PR, but because it's a way the Christian should live. There are many papal events during my 30 years that I've covered that seem staged. Some of them were very well staged. Even John Paul II, of course, who was an actor for a time in his life, he was a master of the stage. Francis doesn't like the stage, but he does like people. And he's not afraid to interact with people in front of crowds or TV cameras. And I'm convinced that that will help make the church more real, more relevant, and more communicating the gospel, make communicating the gospel that much more effective, which is really what communicating in the church is all about. So I thank you. Okay.
John, I would like to thank you this evening for taking us behind the scenes of power, personalities, and politics at the Vatican. It's an enticing, titillating title for a talk. But actually, what John invited us to do tonight is to appreciate the utter and sheer humanity of the Vatican and the fact that at one moment in history, the Word became flesh and took on all the attributes of the human condition. Some of those attributes are beautiful and good, others are tiring, others are downright weak and sinful. And all of that goes into the composite picture, the mosaic of the Catholic Church. And I can only reiterate what John said. Thank God that we see the back end of the tapestry at times and the pieces of the mosaic. Because if everything went together in one direction, it would not be a very interesting story. And I'm not sure we would have ever had the media coverage that we had in February, March, April, and that continues now because there's such a great humanity in the person of Pope Francis. You've helped to tell us tonight the story, but you've done that for over 30 years in Rome, and you've done it through the auspices of the Catholic News Service. He is one of the leading Vaticanistas of the English-speaking world, and many people of the other languages and language groups have often looked to John and looked to Catholic News Service as an institute, an agency of great, great decency, CNS, immense decency and honesty. And it's for all of those reasons tonight that as the president of Assumption University, I have one prerogative or privilege of choosing the person who will receive each year the gold medal, the Faith and Culture Medal. Let me just read to you a little bit about the medal because some of you weren't around for previous award ceremonies. My predecessor, a confrere, a great figure who I had the privilege of knowing, Father Stan Murphy. I see some of you nodding that you remember him. Father Murphy developed the Christian Culture series years ago at a time when such events were unthought of. They were not on the horizon. They were not on people's agendas. And people came from all over the place to see what was happening here. Father developed the Christian Culture Medal, and he wanted to model it on the Laetare Medal from the University of Notre Dame, and also another medal from St. Bonaventure's called the Catholic Action Medal. And so this medal that we're giving tonight has a tremendous history. Listen to some of the people who have received this particular award, most of the time awarded to lay people. Sigrid Undset, Jacques Maritain, Frank Sheed, Henry Ford II, Etienne Gilson. In the 1960s, William Albright, Carl Stern, John Howard Griffin. In the 70s, Dorothy Day, whose cause for canonization is now moving forward. Marshall McLuhan, Jean Vanier, Malcolm Muggeridge, who gave us the story of Mother Teresa. In the 1980s, Rosemary Houghton, Robert Rambush, Martin Marty. In the 1990s, a great moral theologian, Lisa Sol Cahill, Dr. John Charles Poliani. In the 2000s, Martin Sheen, Cardinal Mark Ouellet, one of the rare clerics who received this award, who's now the prefect of the Congregation of Bishops, and a great thinker in the person of Charles Taylor from McGill University. And now tonight we add to this illustrious list, the ones I read and so many more, John Thavis, because he represents for us the best of what faith and culture can bring to us, how a deep Catholic faith can help us to become loving critics and critical lovers, especially in the world of media. When that love is there of the church, we can take the message and say, this is good, this is true, as painful as some of the information is to hear, because a lot of us don't like to hear those negative stories, but that's part of who we are. So we'd like to thank you tonight for bringing faith and culture together in your wonderful profession. And though you may no longer be a Vaticanista on location in Rome, you certainly are, because you check those websites every morning and you keep in touch. And thanks for keeping us in touch. So would you come forward to receive the medal?